Welcome to our web development class. Last week we talked about HTML5 and CSS with respect to the contributions they have made to enabling responsive design. We looked at the new HTML5 elements giving us semantic replacements so that we have less code to write, and we talked about CSS3 enabling faster download times. So we will see today how some of the newer CSS3 properties allow us to replace traditional image effects. Older browsers will ignore them, so nothing is broken in the event that there is no support. So here again, this helps us to reduce download times, bandwidth, reduce HTTP requests, and enables faster page loads, not only on a smaller mobile device, but on all devices in general. For some CSS3 properties, you may still need what are called vendor prefixes or browser prefixes. These properties would be preceded by the below prefixes for the different organizations and their browsers. So this is an example of how a CSS3 property might look with the vendor prefixes. Generally, the last line of code would be the W3C specification, so that in the event that they support that, that will be the last one they read. So let's take a look at the text shadow property. Now this is not supported in IE 9 and earlier, so that if it doesn't show, nothing is really lost. We still see the text. What this does is set a right and bottom shadow, similar to a drop shadow if you are a Photoshop user. So here in our CSS syntax for our H1 selector, we see the text shadow property, and it takes 3 values at minimum, 3 required values. And notice they are not comma separated. The first value is the horizontal offset of the shadow. The second value is the vertical offset of the shadow. And the third value is the color of the shadow. The text shadow property has an optional blur radius. And you can see in the example that it gives it a nice soft effects around the shadow. Here again, as you change the values of the horizontal and vertical offset in combination with the blur radius, you can get very different effects. To remove the text shadow property, simply set the value to none. Should you wish to reverse the direction of the shadow to the left and top, all you need to do is to put a minus sign in front of the horizontal and vertical offsets, as shown in the example here. You can create multiple shadows with this property, and how you do that is you just comma separate the values for each individual shadow. Bear in mind now that the first shadow coded will be directly behind the letters, and the next shadow will be behind that. So you need to make sure that the values for the horizontal and vertical offset for the second or third or fourth shadow are farther apart, or else you may not see it. Alright, so we are used to working in a pixel world. However, you should be using EM units of measure for your text. Now, when it comes to borders and shadows, should we be using PX or EM? Well, for responsive design, PX seems to work well as the values are relatively small and they seem to scale nicely from one device to another. However, you can use the target divided by context rule that we will learn in Chapter 3 to convert to an EM measure for true responsive design. The box shadow property. Here again, most of these properties are not supported in IE9 and earlier. However, it just won't see it, so nothing is broken. The box shadow property sets a right bottom shadow. Here again, Photoshop users, similar to a drop shadow, and the syntax should be familiar. At minimum, you need a horizontal offset, a vertical offset, and the color of the shadow, as demonstrated in the syntax below. The box shadow property also will take an optional blur radius, and notice they need to go in this order, or this is the order in which they will be interpreted and applied. Notice that the blur radius gives it a nice soft edge. And similar to Photoshop, we also have an optional spread distance, which will move that shadow out. Now here again, our shadow is on the bottom right, which is pretty much the standard. Should we wish to move it to the top left, all we need to do is to use negative values for the horizontal and vertical offset. The inset parameter for the box shadow, it gives us a very nice inner blur, inner shadow. Now if you notice in my code, I have set the horizontal and vertical offset to 0 pixels. And by doing that, you actually force the browser to put that shadow on all 4 sides, either inside or around it. However, you need to have a relatively high blur radius to do that. It is not possible to just omit the position for the horizontal and vertical offset. The browser is expecting something there. So if you were to omit it, the first 2 values would be 30 pixel pound 88888, and that does not compute technically, so nothing would work. So if you want to set it to 0, you have to say 0. Here again, on the box shadow without the inset, it will force the shadow to go all the way around the container. I like this effect very much. You can also create multiple shadows using the box shadow property. Similar to the text shadow property, each series of values are comma separated. Here again, bear in mind that the first shadow is closest to the object. The subsequent shadows would be behind the first shadow, so you would need to make sure that the horizontal and vertical offset values are larger than the first, or else you will not be able to see it. And here is an example from css3.info, an excellent resource, by the way, where we have multiple shadows with different offset values here, which make an interesting effect. To remove a box shadow property, simply set the value to none. The border radius property, which is not in the textbook, will be covered in this class. The border radius property allows us to place rounded corners around a container. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind, that if you are going to use the border radius property, the container or the background has to be of contrasting colors, or you need to have a border with a color. For example, if you have a border radius set on a white container which is sitting on a white background, you will not be able to see the curve. You need some kind of contrast in order to see the curve. So the border radius property, if it is set to 1 value, it will set all 4 radii the same. So essentially what we're working with is a top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right edge. And if you look at the diagram here, what we're doing for each corner is we are actually setting a vertical and horizontal radii. So if it is just 1 value, it means that the vertical and the horizontal are set to the same, and in this example it would be 15 pixels. However, should you wish to skew that angle, as we see here, you can set the vertical and horizontal radii differently, and you will get a skewed angle. Remember, it is applying to the 4 different corners, and they will be applied differently, and so therefore the effect will not be the same, although it will be symmetrical. You can create a circle using the border radius property. You would need to set the radius to 35 pixels, and you would need to use a square container. The width and the height would need to be the same. Here is a combination of the border radius with the box shadow. Notice what an interesting effect we can have. The border radius property is well supported in most browsers. It was one of the first CSS3 properties that was actually introduced. However, should you wish to set the individual sides, the syntax changes, as we can see here. And it did vary with the different browsers, so you might still want to look into using the vendor prefixes because the actual syntax is different from the W3 specifications. It's not just a matter of adding the vendor prefix to it. If you remember from our HTML class, when you're working with containers, the container has content, and you can put padding inside that container, and you can also put a border around that container. So if the container was, say, 400 pixels, and you added 10 pixels of padding to each side, we're now looking at a 420 width container. And then if we have a border, that might even be 5 pixels, now we've just added 10 more. So in traditional CSS, borders and padding are actually added to the width. So when it comes to page layout, this needs to be taken into consideration. So the outline property, which is not necessarily CSS3, but I'm bringing it in here because it's an excellent way to see your containers when developing, because it does not add any width to the actual container. And here again, it acts exactly like the border property, where it takes a width, a style, and a color. You can set them all together, or you can set them separately. Not to say that you can't use this also in your CSS layout. However, CSS3 has introduced the box sizing property, and you will see this in a lot of people's style sheets, especially in a reset style sheet or a normalized style sheet, which actually puts everything to a starting point, and we will talk about this again. The box sizing property allows you to tell the browser not to add in things such as padding and border. So it actually adds it to the inside, not the outside, so that you don't have to worry about your calculations.